Greetings and salutations, dear friends and listeners. The incorrigible Mr. Zeppo is back after a little mini hiatus. I totally just failed at kickstarting the show right at 11:11, which I had wanted to do. I think it started at 11:12. It's now 11:13 p.m. on a Friday night. This is Late Night Thoughts. Tonight on the show, happy Juneteenth. For the first time ever in American history, it is finally a federal holiday. There is a technicality. People are saying national holiday, and I hate to be that nerd pushing the glasses up on the thing. Federal holiday, it will become a national holiday fully when all 50 states adopt their own supporting legislation, acknowledging and welcoming that holiday into their state. And small steps, right? One step for mankind. One small step for mankind, or whatever the moon landing phrase is. However that goes. Today's show is me coming back to you after a long space of sitting back and wanting to take a deep breath and a big step back. Take a look at these big pictures. Try to absorb some of these public discourse trends and patterns going on out there. And given that today is the very first day, or the very first instance of a new federal holiday, which is, in my opinion, long overdue, recognizing something in American history that is, to this point in time, polarizing and curiously triggering to folks in all kinds of ways from all kinds of camps. I am of the very sincere opinion that celebrating the official celebration of Juneteenth at the federal level, as we are currently doing, if I'm not mistaken, it got signed into officialness and presented to the world just in time for federal employees, however many million of them there are, to have this Friday off, as we are, otherwise it'd be a Saturday and you're already be off, and what would be the point of that? But this celebration, as a sort of epic first, is really a historic moment, because a long time coming. And that's really, truly worth taking a moment to contemplate as a nation. Taking a moment to honor as a community, I think. And as I wrote in my blurb, it's not just a historic first, it is also a call to action, which we'll talk about in depth in today's show. But I want to kind of lead off with the fact that it's already seeming to stir up a bit of controversy. There's already, in the ebb and flow of public discourse on the social media interwebs of telecommunications, all kinds of interesting commentary, not the least of which is the very real and sort of hard-hitting observation that, as in the same congressional moment, if I can coin a phrase, they voted to approve this new holiday, and those who voted against it made some really ridiculous statements that just sort of exposed themselves for being what they deny being, in a way. It's like, wow, you're really calling yourself out. Angry white man. But not to be reverse racist. Was that reverse racist of me to say? I don't know. Is there such a thing? Can comedy be comedy? But okay, so this historic first, as flawed as it may be in its context, given that at the state level, some 14 or 15 states are using boilerplated, rubber-stamped legislation issued forth from the same sort of central source, which is exactly the thing that they complain about with the federal government. To pause there for a hot second and acknowledge some deep hypocrisy. We don't need to go, into ye olde ancient times of American history to be like, the fuck is wrong with you? You don't see that. Like they bitch and moan about the federal government. Like I've seen the GOP, leadership being strong, manly men speaking out against the federal government, but they're taking into their states not some locally developed, home tested, like approved by the people representation, set of measures that really do improve voter security, but rather some think tank centralized boilerplate stuff that laser targets communities and has been called out for doing so by one or two different courts in the land. Quite a miscarriage of justice there, and an affront. If there is any hope, if there is any validity, let's not go too crazy, right? And throw the entire idea of self-governance and democracy out the window. Not just yet. Because we're not, despite all the accusations from certain political cuckoo birds, most people I know aren't actually crazy, raging socialist communists out to destroy America. What's wild... Wait, backing up. Spinning out of control. So call to action. So some of the flaws of context here that, these voting rights bills are being placed, and that at the federal level, they're failing to do a bunch of things that'd be really helpful. So, one can get really snarky and satirical and stew in the sort of reactionary disgust at the failure of the system. But one can also realize that the fact that this is now a federal holiday is in and of itself a powerful platform, right? To have those difficult conversations. Because as I've called out before, and I will speak out against and speak towards in this show again and again, racism is real in America. And it's trying to get away with being normalized right in front of our faces. So any opportunity to celebrate, and also with sobriety and with somberness and with respect and without all that white ego fragility, which I can understand, right? I really can. I think as an independent third party, if I may be so bold as to label myself that way in regards to this general context. And those of you who've been listening to the show long enough understand why I think I can actually qualify myself in that fashion, and kind of mean it and not be too bullshitty about it. But as an independent third-party observer, those of you who are new to the show and don't know why I just said that, it'll all piece together. But just run with me on this. I feel that it is a very clear and very real danger in our current socio-political context that racism, both in its banal and kind of annoyingly, sort of absurdly ridiculous, least toxic forms, which are the hardest ones to have the conversations with, and also in its darkest, scariest forms, which are hard to imagine for many people if they've never witnessed it in real life, if they've never encountered it or come across it in any real, tangible way. And that it isn't some monolith, but it is very, very real. And there is currently an ongoing, sophisticated, and kind of complex, because it uses a bit of reverse psychology, and I would argue in some cases double reverse psychology, and it uses sophisticated neurolinguistic manipulation tactics to both dismiss and attempt to minimize and mitigate that reality and undermine the arguments of those standing up to it, while also normalize the toxicity, the toxic attitudes, the toxic underlying social norms, which are, from my perspective, some kind of sociopathy, some sort of dysfunction in the brain, and some sort of spiritual disease, because it isn't just a radical and toxic ideology, but it most certainly is that. All right. The controversy is complex because it's got, the critiques have got some valid points. There were some pretty gnarly and searing memes I've come across in the hours ensuing immediately after the announcement, which I think for many people was a bit of a surprise. I think it's safe to say, I think it's fair to say that a broad swath of the American public just didn't have that on their radar for one reason or another. And we'll dive into those memes in just a second. But as I am trying to stick to our exciting, more dynamic template for the show, here's a bit of dubstep music for you, created on the Remix Live app by our very own fictional animatronic imaginary character, DJ Zed. New Creation Blues, from his forthcoming imaginary album, New Beginnings. So this first one's the first one I saw circulating, and it's real, it's raw, and I'm going to read it anonymously because that's how I roll in this show. I don't want to get accused of trolling anybody, and for me, it's more about like the intellectual content, right? Like I'm not trying to steal anybody's intellectual content, but I want to get at discussing and unpacking the statement and the ideas behind it. So, quote, "They painted BLM instead of defunding the police, clapped for essential workers instead of raising the wage, and made Juneteenth a holiday instead of making sure black folks can vote. Always a symbolic victory instead of a material change." It's valid, but it also, like, there's more going on in the world than just that. And each of those things have value, even if they aren't the more desirable outcome. Even as symbolic victories, they also like live on beyond that and have an impact. How many conversations were had behind closed doors in people's homes at family sitting around family dinners because that was going on, because the news coverage exposed them to the ideas and to the concerns and the complexities of this issue to someone that had never thought about it before. So there's also, not to overbash, I'm not trying to argue against. It's just, this is one of those things that's both really, really true and should be applauded for being called out, right? God forbid we should live in a world where this kind of statement isn't stated. But we shouldn't also let ourselves get so jaded by this kind of critique that, the jadedness then detracts from the actual value and the actual potential available in these symbolic victories. The other meme that I saw is a picture meme, and I've seen this discussing other things, sometimes silly and absurd, sometimes serious, and I don't know where this comes from, and obviously I don't know who this person is, but it's been a meme for some time, and it's a youth, some kid, walking up some steps, and he's stepping over several steps to reach up in an absurd length, like kind of silly walks level silliness. And if you're not familiar with the meme, allow me to over describe it. On each step, there's some statement or some word or some issue usually that's being stepped over or skipped. So in this one, the steps read from the lowest step to the top step, talking about race in schools, voting rights, stopping police violence, reparations, and then the very top step that the kid, who happens to be someone wearing a red hat, and this kid happens to be apparently a white Caucasian male. And I feel bad for whoever this individual is. I always feel bad for people who become memes, but that's a whole other issue. It's neither here nor there. That's my own personal struggle. The top step is making Juneteenth a national holiday. So, kudos for calling this out, right? Because we can't, as a community of allies and and I'm sure people of color understand this. I don't need to be preaching to them, but I mean, as a person who sits right smack dab in the awkward sort of wait, people confuse me for whatever they just want to assume I am, color spectrum of skin coloration, I consider myself a person of color. But I've had many awkward conversations with other people of color where they reject me from that categorization based on, a visual read of my skin tone. And such is life. But that's neither here nor there. I do think it's valid and fair for me to speak in terms of like how allies to people of color can make their best effort to be strong, solid allies. Because sometimes I feel like, I'm not dark enough to be a person of color, but I'm also not white enough to be white. So I think I can speak in all directions, honestly. And it just might be a little jarring to people depending on their perspective. So in this case, specifically around this holiday, I see that the discussion is happening in all kinds of places. And the fact that discussion is happening it's got intrinsic value in and of itself, and is another small, slightly less symbolic and more meaningful, tangible victory. So I encourage you, friends, to go out there and have that discussion and talk about this as this final meme that I come across, which I think is also a really strong meme. Just always want to give it with. It's a strong admonition. It's a strong critique of the gestalt of our current moment. But also has an edge of be wary of the toxic version of this. Let us not slide into the cynicism and the jadedness so deep that it becomes an ego trap. But it reads, the fact that the U.S. made Juneteenth a national holiday at the same time as a slew of new laws nationwide pushed voting rights back towards Jim Crow is the most American shit ever. Those three hit strong, I think, but also have all things have their toxic ego trap waiting somewhere to seduce us into a place that is no longer helpful and becomes in and of itself toxic. And such is the way of growth and learning and evolving. I myself actually do think that this country is enduring a kind of organic, collective, growing pain. In the way, in the sort of old school, I don't know if it's still used, but, in that sense of when the human body is going through puberty, it experiences growing pains. It's a strange thing, and it's no accident that there is such a strong and vehement and angry and toxic but it's not racist backlash to critical race theory. Most of the insane, crazy things that have been said about it by people who are by the quote thought leaders of the extreme right are easily debunked if one just sits down and actually reads the theory. Right? Like reads the content of the actual written work by those who crafted the theory and understand it in its context. It's not stuff that's being taught it's not being taught in K through 12. It never has been. Someone said recently that I think that apparently they want to teach it in California schools, but that takes like 2 or 3 years before they approve it and process it and it gets into the books. As it's actually existed, critical race theory has been graduate level law school content that gets discussed in relationship to a bunch of other critical analysis theories about about legal issues. And quite frankly, a clear-eyed and honest assessment of for example, because it is no coincidence that there's a massive amount of supposed voter protection, voter fraud, security election laws that are being enacted in a state-by-state way, which are all kind of boilerplatey and weirdly, based on, a bunch of lies and a really specific, strategic attempt to tip the scales in terms of voter turnout and access to the ballot box. Now, years ago, I don't remember how long I made this meme, but it feels like it was years ago. It might have been months ago, but quite some time ago, I feel, I made a meme comparing and contrasting a Mark Twain statement that says, if voting really solved anything, I may be paraphrasing it wrong, but I'm close. If voting worked, they wouldn't let us do it. If voting was real, they wouldn't let us do it. And my response, I put him and I side by side. Well, the character I play, I put him and Mr. Zeppo side by side. And I was like, if voting is fake, why are they trying so hard not to let us do it? Huh? I, for one, am glad and supportive and was quite moved by the symbolic victory and by the pageantry and the political theater. Put a pin in that, because I talk about that extensively in the show. If you're new to the show, political theater is a massive issue here. And I have an unorthodox and somewhat nuanced point of view on it. So don't go projecting your assumptions. Just tune into the show and check out what I've got to actually say. But that particular piece of political theater, if I may be so bold as to suggest, had some value in it because for many people, it was a great injustice and a painful reality that this nation had continued to deny and reject and not care to honor and celebrate what this holiday represents. And so, for many people in America, it's more than just a hollow symbolic victory. It literally is a powerful baby step, a small but powerful step in the right direction that will empower future generations to take stronger steps in the right direction. Because if we don't acknowledge the history and the facts of the violence and the hate and the racial suppression and the sublimation of it into less overt forms, which continue to exist today, what are we doing, right? Like we must have every opportunity to have those discussions and to share that information as to counterbalance some of the other memes. So those three memes I was just talking about, a couple of memes that I myself have shared and have had some thoughts to talk about it, and some incidences of direct personal, instances of having to communicate this to others because they needed to hear it, despite the fact that it's already out there, right? I didn't write this meme, but I wish I had. If you're tired, quote, if you're tired of hearing about racism, imagine how tired some people are of experiencing it. And I literally, wrote that to someone in another conversation from another post, because they came to that post with the statement of being exhausted about hearing about racism. I can consider myself someone, I can include myself as someone who has experienced and directly observed the raw reality of racism and racists in America. So I cannot abide, I cannot support, I cannot side with that exhaustion that many Caucasian Americans feel. And I know that probably rubs a lot of them the wrong way when I speak about it on social media or when I talk about it on this podcast. But therein, my friends, the opportunity to heal lies. So if you're an ally that already gets it, right, whatever origin you are, if you're a Latinx ally to our African American brothers and sisters, in this issue, in this moment, this weekend, as we celebrate Juneteenth and Father's Day, make the time, make the effort to remind those, because everybody has someone in their circle, in their community, in their circle of friends, and in their family that may have that sense of exhaustion, right? And that may not think of themselves as a racist. Like that lady in that video that's gone viral that keeps getting featured on the news, speaking out at a school thing where they weren't teaching critical race theory. And she's saying, it's a white lady, typical kind of Karen, fragile whiteness on display, bless her heart. She's weeping because of her own frustration and pain, right? And everyone's relative level of frustration and pain is, of course, valid and real to them. Just as we can't dismiss any minority's feelings about the way of the world, we can't dismiss the fact that frustration is real. But we have to, that frustration is an opportunity for them to be guided into their own healing, in my personal opinion, right? But this lady's speaking out just because she doesn't want critical, and I'm butchering what she said, but she basically says, just because I don't want critical race theory taught to my kids in school doesn't automatically make me a racist. Of course not. But if you're frustrated at hearing about racism, you have to ask yourself, and if I'd been at that meeting, or if, whenever I'm in the presence of, or on the social media presence of someone who's expressing this, this is what comes to mind, and this is the kind of thing I've got to say, right? And these are my words, that this is my caption from when I shared this meme. Instead of complaining about how tired you are of hearing about racism, why not, or why aren't you helping to end racism, right? Why aren't you helping to heal the cause of racism? Why aren't you helping to hold accountable those who perpetuate racism? Why are you, if I'd been there talking to that lady at that school board, I'm like, why are you caught up in misinformation and fighting against something which at its core is a tool that will facilitate the end of racism through the process of healing the cause of racism by holding accountable the historical reality of racism? If you're not a racist, you should not be intimidated by critical race theory. And if you are intimidated, if you read it, if you actually go, there's a PDF, I should post it. I think I've got it somewhere. Just go and read the actual document written by the actual, I'm totally blanking on her name now, and forgive me. That's just a moment because I didn't expect to reference it so much. Just go read the actual critical race theory, right? And realize that for whatever reason, the GOP, and here's the hard pill to swallow, America, and this is the thing that nobody's talking about, I think. Well, that few enough people are openly acknowledging, that I think that plenty of people see and understand. Then I'm gonna call this out, and I think this is a hard and unfortunate fact. Why is the GOP, the leadership, why are the politicians in the grand old party using that subject as a whipping post? Why is that subject being used to prod and whip the base into a frenzy? Why are they urging parents to storm their school boards and make these kind of ridiculous self-canceling complaints? Why? If they're not racists, right? And I bet you every single last politician out there spinning nonsense about any and all educational efforts. It's not just, as another meme that I didn't save and put in front of my face points out, the extreme right and the GOP, which the extreme right is just sort of comfortably in the center of the big umbrella of the GOP, that cannot be denied. If you don't there's a lot of right wingers, there's a lot of Republicans that are like, but I'm not a racist. Like, yeah, but your party is welcoming and embracing and reliant on the racist vote. Why else are they also targeting and trying to minimize the black vote and the Latino vote and the foreigners? Like, everybody who's a foreigner doesn't deserve to vote. And that's what it's about. And that's at the core of it, right? Everybody out there that legitimately isn't a racist and is a strong ally and has someone in their immediate circle of circles that is one of these I'm not a racist Republicans. And those Republicans, especially if they've got the blinders on, they've got their fingers in their ears, and they're pulling the line, they're towing the line of the party in defense of whatever the fuck else they're clinging to about the party and the platform, which, let's be honest, the party's platform is absurd and ridiculous and is A, full of holes like Swiss cheese, and B, full of absurdly obvious hypocrisies like a two-faced golden statue of Trump. I don't know, I just made that up as a fucking new symbol. A golden two-faced statue of Trump is the new gold standard of political hypocrisy and psyop manipulation. But that's a whole nother episode, folks. That's the call to action. That's the call to action, inherent. That's the value of this little symbolic victory, is that, all of the people who understand, everyone, sorry for the awkward phrasing there, I just wasn't sure where my sentence was going. Everyone who understands, everyone who's like, yeah, this makes sense. Not because you're agreeing with me, but because you genuinely see that systemic racism is real. You genuinely understand that white privilege is real. You genuinely understand and acknowledge that these tactics are being used by the grand old party to manipulate as many white voters, especially white evangelical Christian voters, especially white, whatever variety of post-American, post-colonial Christian voters, to tolerate and put blinders on this central fact that the big umbrella of the GOP is trying harder to welcome in the white supremacist vote. The real, like, if there's whatever is left of the KKK, they're out there voting. Right? And the GOP is trying to keep them under their tent instead of call them out, kick them out, and make a stand, an actual stand against racism. And of course, the first thing they do is project and vilify and paint the Democrats as the real racists, and it just devolves into this crazy echo chamber of echo chambers from there. Dear friends, I have rambled at you long enough. let's wrap this show up with a final bit of electronic danceable music from the future for your listening pleasure. Thank you for tuning in, friends. This is one of those things that the whole world is coming to terms. It's not just an American issue. Hate is real, folks, and it will create us versus them divisions. So racism is just an ism, in as much as that it is an ideological construct engineered and designed to indoctrinate as many people of a certain category, which is often just sort of a made-up label anyways. What is skin color beyond an absurd thing that is unchangeable and kind of that you're born to and otherwise irrelevant, right? To the real, not irrelevant, because it's a double-edged sword there. I can get really misunderstood really quickly with that. Like, in a perfect world, it would be irrelevant, but in the world as we actually exist in, it has had massive impact in people's lived experience. Hateism is real. Racism is just a facet. It's one symptomology of a bigger, more complex problem, if I may be so bold. That isn't dismissing racism, right? I'm calling out those who are trying to dismiss racism, minimalize it, and or otherwise facilitate that white supremacist voting bloc into getting away with somehow normalizing their bias into the right wing of the two-winged singular bird, right? Because it's two wings, one bird. That's the real problem. But racism being a very specific, in historical American history, a very specific form of hateism, we have to, if we're really going to solve it, not get caught up in any of the pettier arguments. Not to sound judgy or don't misunderstand me here. Right? But there is a spiritual level at which we can address it that will, if done correctly, in my humble opinion, be so profound and transformative that it will rectify the sort of chain of causality that creates the systemic racism. To wrap up my thoughts, someone posted a dear social media friend posted a meme that said, there can't be no systemic racism if there is no system. And I got into a discussion with them. I'm like, that's clever, but also destroying the system isn't going to solve systemic racism. Because you'll just build a new system, whatever you call it, however it's different, and the racism will encroach back into it. Because even if you eliminated, the anarchists and all them, and the libertarians supposedly, and even the Trumptopians and the Q heads for sure, they're fantasizing that somehow, in some shape or form or way, if you manage to just magically, and they fantasize about their different ways of doing it, all these different groups, but if you just got rid of government, all the problems would be fixed. And I'm sorry, but that is some naive ass nonsense that you really shouldn't let your friends fall for. Friends, don't let friends believe that is going to solve anything, because it's not. Now, does that make me a bootlicker? No, but everyone immediately jumps to that fucking programming. They start peddling that pre-programmed insult your way out of the discussion nonsense. Just eliminate, if you overthrew the government, if you somehow voted the government out of existence, if you engineered a way to get rid of government, if you waved a magic wand and all government just ceased to exist, that would not automatically solve any problems, and arguably just make things worse. Because, especially if we stay here with the racism framework, like, there would still be good old-fashioned individual and mob racism, which would lead to good old-fashioned individual and mob racist violence. Because there would still be individual and mob mentality hate. Hateism, the ismification of hate into things like racism, into things like chauvinism, into things like Nazism, all the different isms of hate. They stem from a root cause that must be addressed at the appropriate framework, right? So rebuilding the system, destroying the system, replacing the system, if you're not healing the human beings involved, if you're not facilitating in the healing of the human species at all y'all, including the baddest of the bad guys, if we're not busy healing Trump and the most obnoxious of the Q base, if we're not busy healing ourselves at an individual level, stepping up to that responsibility and acknowledging part of healing, my friends, is acknowledging the horrors. And that's all they're asking, right? That's all that people who are fighting for these victories are asking. As another meme points out, right, because racism in America isn't just against African Americans and the descendants of slaves. Remember the entire native Aboriginal people that they wiped out when they first got here? As another meme points out, the descendants of colonial white colonizers are lucky as fuck that the indigenous Native American descendants of the people that got wiped out are only asking for recognition and not revenge. More on the subject of this and other complex issues in upcoming episodes. And now that bit of electronic music I promised you way too long ago, friends. Thank you for tuning in. And I humbly ask you to share your thoughts and questions and concerns over on the official Facebook page for this eccentric AF podcast that you've grown to love and respect and follow and share with your friends and family. The Almost Daily ZenCast. Head on down to Facebook and type the parentheses Almost Daily ZenCast and you'll find it. And or follow the link on the page for the show on Sprecher.com.